So taking the opportunity to go to local government and go direct to President Dave Cull, who is, of course, former Dunedin Mayor and joins us now. Dave, of course, we've known each other being in my local area of Otago and Dunedin. I know that you've got a great batch in Terrace. Have you enjoyed isolation there?
Yes, I did, and I haven't been up there for, obviously, the whole lockdown period. I've been back here in Dunedin, so...
It's a great spot.
This is where my veggie garden is.
Yeah, absolutely, and great spot to get out on the bike as well, I'm sure.
Right, yes, indeed.
Dave, you're a very busy man, so thank you for taking the time to join us. But, of course, there's been a lot of media pressure lately about do we raise or freeze rates in a terrible economic time with a lot of rising unemployment, the highest in what it's going to be since the early 90s. And it's not, of course, that straightforward to be able to just go out and loan. So my first question, I suppose, to you is what is the challenges in balancing, of course, rate rises versus lending for infrastructure?
Well, I guess we need to be thinking about the position that councils are in and what councils are there for. And councils are there to create services and infrastructure to support their communities. And the things that were needed prior to the COVID crisis are still there. So the water pipes or the wastewater pipes or whatever under some city streets that are need of a renewal, they still need renewing. The work that needs to be done to mitigate flood risks from climate change, etc., they still need to be done. And so the responsibilities of councils haven't gone away. And in fact, there's an increased expectation on councils that they'll be part of the economic recovery, that they will need to keep investing in infrastructure that's needed and improvement of their communities. But at the same time, their ratepayers have got a reduced ability to pay their rates because, as you say, so many of them are likely to be unemployed, etc. And other forms of council funding have actually dried up. So about, on average, 40% of council funding comes from non-rates sources. So parking fees, facilities entry fees, perhaps council-owned company dividends, etc. Most of those through the COVID period have disappeared. So councils have actually got really reduced funding, but they still need to be able to invest in the essential infrastructure and in the economic recovery projects that the government has been putting up. So a lot of councils are really wrestling with this issue of we know what we need to do, how are we going to find the funding to do it? So a good number of them have put forward proposals to Crown Infrastructure Partners for shovel-ready projects that could be put in place, pretty quickly. But they will need, I warn, co-investment. The government's not going to give them all the money. Councils have to put some in as well. So that's the position that a good many councils are in.
Is this just actually a sign of the times of how heavily weighted on local councils? A lot of expectation of infrastructure was unfairly weighted to the rating base. I think particularly of places that was heavily under pressure from tourism, like Tekapo and Queenstown.
Yeah, look, there's the proportion of GDP, if you like, that goes to councils has stayed pretty much the same for 100 years. It's about 5%. But the proportion of government funding, GDP that goes to government funding, has risen from about 20 to 30% in the same period of time. So yes, there have been greater demands on local government, and it's a very rating, which is about 60% of council funding, is a very narrow base. And on top of that, over time, central government has imposed what we call unfunded mandates on local government. In other words, they've given them jobs to do, given local government responsibilities, but they haven't given them the corresponding funding lines to pay for it. So I remember talking to a small district mayor a little while ago, and she told me that over several years, the increase in rates, 3% of their rates increase, was down to more responsibilities, unfunded mandates from central government. And that was before inflation, before anything else. So yes, it is an issue.
And of course, RMA reforms are constantly on the table from a central government level and political football. But even more so now as infrastructure wants to get to shovel ready. In particular, Dave, I'd like to address some of the regional infrastructure that, of course, our audience here in Serious Country really want to focus on, being able to get these things finally across the line. So it not only brings, the ability for important things like water storage and irrigation to these areas, but of course, further employment and economic benefit.
Yeah, and they are hugely important to both our economic well-being and our environmental well-being, and some of those are really important in terms of our adaptation to climate change effects. So these are issues, as I said earlier, that were there before COVID. They're still there. We still need to confront them, and we still need to be spending to address them.
Okay, Dave, so tonight on Serious Country, we're running a poll, just probably a little bit more to highlight the fact that it's not so straightforward, because it's very much a hard situation, and you've been in Mayor several different terms. How to balance those promises of the lolly scramble around rates similar to taxes, yet at the same time have the funds and ability to get on and do so. So our poll tonight is around, how do we either freeze or reduce rates, or do we choose to lend? And what do you think the right mix is going to be, as well as, of course, central government support?
Right. Well, for a start, there'll be some councils who have the capacity and the headroom to borrow, to take on debt, rather than put up their rates. But interestingly, some of the big growth councils, like Hamilton, Tauranga, Auckland, have reached their debt ceiling because they've already had to spend an enormous amount on rolling out infrastructure. You don't get new housing developments until you put the infrastructure in the ground. That costs squillions before you even get a house built. But you've got to spend it ahead. So some councils won't be able to borrow. Some other councils will be able to borrow. And I think in some ways that's a fairer thing for their community, because you either pay your rates up front and raise extra money by increasing your rates, or you borrow and it gets paid for over a longer period of time. And that's pretty fair, because successive generations benefit from that. So successive generations contribute to repaying the debt. So in some cases, it's viable for communities to borrow. And there's often a lot of resistance from communities to their councils borrowing and taking on debt. But it's not that much different from having a mortgage. Not many people can afford to pay for a house with cash, and no more than communities can afford to put essential infrastructure that keeps them safe in the case of drinking water and wastewater disposal by just paying cash for it. So you borrow.
Dave, lastly, your opinion. Do you think as Kiwis we need to seriously start being more long-term minded?
I think we do, and I think the other thing we need to understand is that if you want services and infrastructure in your community, it has to be paid for. The idea that the less tax you pay, the happier you'll be, is a myth.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us as President of the Local Government New Zealand, Mr. David Cull, of course, former Mayor of Dunedin. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
This is Serious Country.